So hello and welcome to Horse Race Politics. My name is Dr. Matthew Wall and I'm a political scientist at Swansea University. And I'm joined by my colleagues.
Hi, my name's Dr. Elena Kilby and I'm a lecturer in journalism in the Department of Media and Communication at Swansea University.
And I'm Dr. Richard Thomas, a senior lecturer in the same department.
So we're all academics who are specialised in the study of campaigns and political communication.
And we've created this podcast to share our analysis of the 2020 US presidential election campaign in real time as it unfolds, using information from political gambling markets to keep score.
So the podcast will drop each Friday running into the vote, bringing you up to speed with the state of the race, and it'll help you to filter out the noise of the campaign and will instead focus on the stories, trends, and the big moments that really matter.
So this week marked something of a reset in the campaign after following a chaotic period, with Donald Trump returning to the campaign trail and politics as usual, I suppose, to some extent resuming. We're going to focus this week on how citizens can see the same political events and interpret them quite so differently, looking at how the world is presented to US citizens through different types of media channels, unpacking the idea of media bias, and explaining how it's evolved and changed as politics moves increasingly online. We'll also take a look at some of the key stories of this week, such as Hunter Biden's emails and Donald Trump's unique take on the YMCA dance, as well as looking at efforts by scholars to guide media coverage of the campaign and focusing in on the Lincoln Project, which is sought to convert Republicans over to Joe Biden's side for this campaign. I thought we'd kick off, Richard, with a bit of a discussion of bias. Obviously, for media academic, that's one of your core concepts. Could you tell us a little bit about that idea and how it originated and how you guys analyze it in media and communication?
Sure. Well, I think in the same way, Matt, that last week we said that polls sort of had a basic function of measuring public opinion. When we look at bias, particularly within a regulated news landscape, it gives us some sort of an idea how efficient the regulation is and whether journalists are sort of being true to that basic requirement that they should take a neutral line in the way that they report their stories, particularly politics. And of course, elections are a moment in time when that's particularly important and when a sort of normative expectation of journalism would be that they would steer that middle course between the parties. That's where we have to differentiate between the US and other places like the UK. So there's not much point in measuring or discussing bias or partisanship in the print media in both of those countries, other than to say perhaps that it's there, it exists, and it's often quite clear. But as we mentioned right at the beginning of our podcasts, the US doesn't regulate its broadcasters. It doesn't oblige them to be neutral, or in the word that we use more often to describe that impartial. They abandoned the fairness doctrine in 1987. And so any neutrality that you will see in US broadcast journalism is basically down to sort of the professional standards of the practitioners, or probably more often, the editorial line taken by the organization they work for. And cable has changed everything, really. Network stations like ABC, NBC, CBS, they remain fairly central in terms of the way they present the world. They're not really favoring one over the other particularly strongly. CNN, you could argue, is similar to that. But then within the cable network, you've got MSNBC and Fox, very partisan in comparison to those middle ground. So just to give you an idea, there's a joke doing the rounds at the moment about Donald Trump deciding one day to walk across the Hudson River. And the Fox headline is, "New Messiah Trump walks on water and saves taxpayers the cost of a boat." MSNBC headline is, "Trump unable to swim." So this really sort of illustrates that you get two very different views of the same event. So you pays your money, you takes your choice. The downside, of course, is that if you're looking at one of those partisan stations, your views aren't challenged. You're not given an alternative point of view. You start to consume the news inside this own sort of insulated bubble. There's also another price to pay, in as much as US news, the trust in US news and the belief that it's fair and accurate actually has dropped from 1999, when it was 55% of the population felt that. Now in 2016, that's 32%. So trust is really sort of dipping. In the UK, impartiality is one of the principles of public service, and inevitably, when we're talking about that, it often migrates to becoming an evaluating of the performance and the value of the BBC. Why is that important here? The BBC, new research out, BBC is recognised as a legitimate source for political news by around 3/4 of American adults. So even we think that this is very much a UK thing. BBC, known and trusted all around the world. So when we're measuring impartiality and bias, how do we do it? The big thing is, how do we operationalize bias? We're looking at something, we instinctively think that it might be skewed to one side, but we can't necessarily put our finger on it. How do we, as researchers, operationalize it? Finding things that we can actually measure that indicate that one side is getting a better deal than the other. So the traditional way is with a stopwatch. Who's speaking on screen for how much time, and is it balanced? But there's this thing in the UK, we call it due impartiality. And that word due means that you don't actually have to have the balance within one program, but it needs to be over a longer period of time, which is why we tend to look at whole campaigns rather than one channel or one station. So the sort of things that we try and measure are things like which policies are being mentioned in the news, who's favoured policies. In 2015, for example, we found that the policy agenda on British TV very much in favour of the Conservatives. The tonal bias, which interviewees are being given a harder time, which ones are being given an easier time, which sources are being used, which side is more often on screen in terms of image and in sound. And our conclusion really is, even within a realm where everyone is on the face of it equal, some are definitely more equal than others. There's one thing called the incumbency bonus, which is that generally the side that has power, the people who are the incumbents, in this case Trump, will get more coverage than his opponent. But normally you would expect that to be quite marginal. But I just did a little bit of sort of ninja analysis, if you like, over the last month. I looked at major US newspapers and British newspapers, and I just looked at over a period of a month, and I just looked at how many times Trump or Biden appeared in the headlines. And I can tell you that Trump appeared 3,744 times in my sample, Biden 952.
Wow.
So there are almost 4 times as many stories with Trump in the headline than there are Biden. So we can really say that news values, because whatever Donald Trump is, he's definitely not boring and dull, is he? He's always doing something that creates the news. So that, you could argue, is one of the ways of explaining it. And in 2016, we argue the fact that he was on the screen all of the time sort of helped legitimize him as a candidate. Slightly different this time around, of course. But the incumbency bonus is alive and well, I think, in this election.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because I think there's a bit of a tension, especially on that more liberal side of the American media. So on the one hand, they decry Donald Trump. That's kind of their core message. But he hasn't been bad for business, huh? I mean, even here in the university, if we organize any kind of debate about politics, just stick Donald Trump's face on it and you double the attendance, more or less. And so there is that kind of weird, I guess, interaction or codependency between even liberal media and a political figure like Donald Trump. I mean, Biden, we've talked about him campaigning in prose, right? I mean, he's I think some of that's deliberate, but I think a lot of it is just his limitations as a communicator. I mean, Obama was box office too in a different sense.
I think if we were measuring it on excitement and not on policies and all of that, then there's only one winner, really, isn't there, in this election campaign? I mean, Donald Trump provides the news media with a ready source of stories, the unexpected, and if he feels that there's a lull, he will fill the lull, won't he? He will create a Twitter storm or something just to keep the whole thing moving along.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder, because my area of research, one of my areas is to do with online campaigning more generally. And, we have a phrase over here in the UK and Ireland, where you have a really good game and one side wins, but you say football was the winner today, right?
Yeah.
But it's like the opposite. Nearly no matter who wins, democracy is the loser in this election. And for me, it's interesting because more than any other election before, nearly every election recently has been the most internet election because the penetration is higher and higher. But COVID is sort of exacerbating that even further, right? To where, like, well, at least on the Biden side, the physical campaigning events are very much restricted. And I've been pretty disturbed by what I've seen in that space. On the one side, I mean, maybe you guys are familiar with this QAnon conspiracy, right? Like there's at least one and maybe two Republican candidates for the U.S. Senate who more or less endorse this conspiracy, right? And for those of you who don't know, for those listeners who don't know, the guts of it is, right, that there's a secret insider in the Trump administration who's sending coded messages, initially through 4chan and then through a series of successor sites. And what those codes are basically telling you is that the elite, particularly the liberal elite, and there are elements of anti-Semitism in this as well, are a bunch of pedophiles who are secretly a cabal that are running the world against the interests of the population. And you go to any Donald Trump campaign, you look in Florida there, you'll see these Q signs, you'll hear these slogans that are coded references to QAnon. You're talking about a substantial chunk of the US population and increasingly members of the political elite in this bubble of madness, if you ask me. But then on the other side, look at what happened when Donald Trump declared that he had COVID-19. Look at what happened when he went to hospital. Nearly all of my liberal friends were onto me straight away saying, oh, this is fake news, this is a hoax, this can't be real, right?
Yeah.
The whole basis of argumentation has been so systematically debased, not just in this campaign, but this campaign has moved it on, that democracy is the loser ultimately. And I must say, what the markets have sort of stabilized. Biden is looking very steady, about 64%. He's ticked down a little bit on the back of the Hunter Biden story that we'll talk about later. Joe Biden could win this election by 20 or 30%, and you still have a huge portion of the American population who not only think that he'll be a bad president, but think that he's the head of a pedophile cabal. And that is literally true. Isn't that? I mean, that for me is shocking. And I guess, you see this as well, Elena, in the kind of weaponization, I suppose, of humor online, the type of, I suppose, way that people make fun of each other has changed quite a lot as well. I don't know, is that something you've picked up?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite interesting because I think my research initially began with TV satire programs. So I know Richard's talked a lot about the differences between left and right-wing media. So I think that initial stage of humour started with programs like The Daily Show and shows like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. But initially it was that kind of use of irony and wit, that was a kind of nice weapon, let's say, for left-leaning citizens, because what these shows were able to do was communicate this personal disdain for conservative media, so channels like Fox News or Talk Radio, and how they sensationalized the news, how it was very much opinion-driven rather than being actual journalism, and how that's actually was destroying and still is destroying America's ability to have civil political discussions. So I think on the one side, then you've got these kind of ardent right-wingers who found home in conservative media platforms like Fox and Talk Radio that reflects their own personal views. And then you had these liberal-minded audiences who gravitated towards these late-night comedy programs because those programs did exactly what they wanted them to do. And that was to pick apart the spectacle and the spin of right-wing commentators. And I think over the last decade or so, maybe even 15 years, is this injection of humour into political discourse has received quite a lot of attention and subsequently a lot of replication as well. Part of the reason for this is because of the power dynamic within political satire. And as I've mentioned previously, this is a form of humour that punches upwards at authority, at elite figures, big corporations. And that's why it works so well in activism communication. Now, I've written in the past 2 articles on the Women's March that took place in 2017 and 2018. And what was really noticeable was how the tone of humour changed quite considerably. It became much more aggressive, much more debased. So, and part of the kind of process, what stood out within these marches was the placards and humour signs that people were using. And it was the humour within those signs that changed from one year to the next. So it's quite lighthearted maybe initially. And then, it went on to kind of personal attacks on Trump, comments about his small hands and subsequently his small manhood. And then other claims then about, his harsh immigration policies. But the thing is, I think there's 2 schools of thought on this. The idea that communicating humour is quite trivial. It offers momentary relief, but it also galvanizes support for these political causes as well. So it can facilitate political dialogue between, discursive citizens who are coming together about this same issue. It also can spark civic participation. But again, we're getting back to sparking participation and active citizenship with like-minded individuals. Now, I think more recently, Conservatives appear to have caught on to this approach, and they've realised that they've needed to think of new ways to engage maybe a younger Conservative base and be able to spread their ideas beyond cable TV. So as popular as those platforms were, they're realising, programmes like The Daily Show and John Oliver, even though their programmes are popular, their videos are shared in the thousands online. So I think, Conservatives have realised they need to get on board with that. Now, if we take that in terms of humour, for a long time, the idea of Conservative humour was just a no-go area. So the general consensus being that satire is about speaking truth to power. And this is a position that we would maybe assume is incompatible with the core tenets of what conservatism is. But that view doesn't account for the success of conservative memes in the 2016 presidential election. So where we had social media sites that were bombarded with posts that mocked Clinton's health and also her failure to connect with the electorate. And also we had the success of the Pepe the Frog memes as well. And these really thrived with certain demographics because they reflected this Trump's anti-political correctness stance. Now, in addition to these humour memes on the right, we've also got trolling too. And this has become a really successful communication tactic for them. So we've got provoking outrage by pretty much just relentlessly pumping out rumours on social media. So in 2016, it was Clinton and, being linked to that powerful cabal of paedophiles and child trafficking, otherwise known as Pizzagate. Yeah. And as you just mentioned then about QAnon. But I think even though these rumours were completely unfounded, the story still went viral and it gained massive media attention. So, whatever that attention is, it's good attention, particularly when we're in an attention economy. So that is deemed a success for these people. So I think, similarly to the way that the left have weaponized humour, memes and trolling have become this new currency for non-traditional conservative communication, purely because of its online spreadability, but also because of its potential to control the political conversation.
Yeah, and I've noticed on those right-wing memes, they particularly attack kind of what you might call like liberal identity politics. So, tropes around pronouns, for example. There are all sorts of things about feminists and, it does seem to be less to do with the economic basis of politics or competence or anything like that.
Yeah.
And more centered on that phenomenon of, let's say, the most progressive end, you could call it, of identity politics. For me, I've noticed that seems to be consistently what gets targeted.
Yeah, no, and I think we can see that from 4 years ago as well. We have this kind of rise of young white males. And on the left-hand side is that claims of fragile masculinity. But places like Breitbart have had this massive following with a particular demographic of young white males.
You're Jordan Peterson fans, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But do you know what? Something I've observed as well is, and I think it happened around, there was something called, you might remember, Lena, something called the Rally to Restore Sanity.
Yeah, that was my PhD research.
Yeah. If I look back on that, it's kind of like, in Happy Days, they talk about jumping the shark.
Yeah.
When you're like, I think it's where mixing activism and satire is a dangerous business.
I agree.
And we've seen so much of these satirists just talking about their political opinions, right? They've sort of been reduced to the role of commentators during this campaign. Well, reduced is maybe the wrong word, but they're not as funny as they used to be.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think it's because, from my research in this area, the Rally to Restore Sanity had this, good intentions, but really speaking, it didn't really kind of come to anything. And I think since then, there's been this kind of want from audiences to want to progress that, for satirists to progress these discussions, but I don't think they have the actual power to do that. I think something that we mentioned earlier actually is I've been engaging with these shows now for over 10 years. And what I found quite alarming this year is the lack of engagement really with politics. And particularly when there's important events that are happening this week, whether it's the hearing of Supreme Court with Amy Coney Barrett, there isn't a lot of detail out there. And looking at the shows this week, it's been very much entertainment focused. So I'm wondering whether they don't have the power that they probably did maybe 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. If you can't get a gag out of constitutional originalism, what can you get a gag out of?
Yeah. As you've been speaking about satire, Elena, it reminds me of a line from a Flanders and Swan show.
Oh, I love this.
When they say that the purpose of satire is to strip off the veneer of comforting illusion and cozy half-truth. And then he leaves a gap. And then he says, and our job, as I see it, is to put it back again. It's almost like satire, from what you've been saying, Elena, has sort of lost some of its sort of luster anyway, isn't it? It's redefining itself in some ways, maybe.
I think it has to. As I talked about in the first podcast, it's almost like satire has become reality. So it's very difficult to kind of be edgy and, offer something new to audiences when we're kind of living through this kind of satirical nightmare at the moment.
Okay, well, let's move on to having a look at the stories in the campaign. It's been a kind of a quieter week, and I think that lets us look at some things that might have been a little bit more on the fringe of things in the normal course of this tumultuous campaign. But I know, Richard, you've been itching to talk about the Lincoln project for quite a while.
What I'm not going to do this week, Matt, is to do that ridiculous, breathless shouting out the headlines like I did last week.
I think you need to do it again at some point.
I think you need to make it rhyme and put a beat underneath it,
I'm gonna be like an old, out of shape midfielder in a football match. I'm gonna slow it all down. I'm putting my foot on the ball for a bit, right? So there's a few things happening, as you say, around the fringes. One thing that I think is very interesting is, you remember when Trump came out of hospital and he's sort of recovering from COVID, and he was talking about a miracle and so on, and that there was a lot of that backing up of that sort of idea from Fox as well, with Sean Hannity. A colleague of mine who works on an alt media project that I'm involved with, Kerry Hughes, was a researcher at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He looked at 448 major public addresses by American presidents over the last 100 years, and he's found that Trump by far is using more religious terms than any of the other presidents in the last 100 years. He uses 7.3 religious terms per 1,000 words of speech. It does fluctuate. When, after the Las Vegas shooting 2017, he gave a national address, there was 52 religious terms per 1,000 words. So what Kerry is suggesting, that even while the Trump support might be collapsing in various places, he can count on the sort of white evangelical vote to support him. The other thing is, and we were talking about this last night in a debate arranged by the university, Matt, weren't we, that you were involved with? The Daily Mail columnist Dan Hodges was asked, what can Trump do now? And he said, there's nothing he can do. The brand he's developed is so entrenched, he doesn't have time to sort of turn the ship around. He also said that Biden was conducting a very sort of controlled, disciplined, risk-free campaign. And my contention is that some of the heavy lifting for Joe Biden is being done for him by this organization called the Lincoln Project. It's funded and run by disaffected Republicans who think that democracy should prevail beyond sort of party lines. They want Trump out. They're very assertive about it. Yesterday, for example, there were 30 anti-Trump tweets alone, just in one day. Lots of videos. One video that sort of stood out to me was one that they tweeted out featuring Cindy McCain, the widow of John McCain, very heavily endorsing Biden, doesn't really mention Trump much at all. The story is of the enduring and long-lasting friendship between Joe Biden and John McCain, even though they were sort of political rivals. They didn't believe in the same things at all. What they did share, though, was this idea of public service. And as she said, they would argue like cat and dog on the floor of the House. Then they would go off and have a jolly lunch together. The implicit message was Trump is unable to develop a human approach to his opponents and only sees the opportunity for self-gain. And it sort of comes off the back of that comment he allegedly made about the suckers and losers when he was at the military cemetery. The other thing that I wanted to just mention quickly was it seems like from what plans Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, all these people are making is that they're sort of battening down the hatches for a Biden win, but a Biden win that Trump doesn't accept. So they're talking about their policies about people claiming a win when it's not justified. You know, the fact that they're going to need verification from certain places. I mean, added to that this week, we've got this group of media scholars in North America who formed together this organization called Media for Democracy. Again, they're sort of almost foretelling a Biden win and Trump not accepting the win because they've brought out a series of guidelines and advice about, you know, how media should talk about, for example, the what they see as perhaps an inevitable rise in civil unrest after the election. So that's something that is very interesting. It's very good. It's based on lots of research and empirical work. But I think the fact that they're actually coming up with frameworks, you know, that are mitigating against this civil unrest is a concern, because that seems to be where the kind of smart money is now. It's going to be a Biden win, but Trump's not going to leave the White House without a big fight.
Yeah, I mean, I actually played this podcast to some students in the university during the week, the previous week's podcast, and they said, well, I mean, obviously Biden's going to win, but I mean, the big question is what's Trump going to do afterwards? Yeah. You know, I often wonder, do Republicans in the States feel a bit like conservatives here in the UK? The people who David Cameron used to call swivel-eyed loons are now in charge of the Conservative Party. And your sort of traditional, like, I don't know, New England Republican must look at Donald Trump a little bit askew. You know what I mean? It must be difficult. And as you say, that Lincoln Project is the kind of incarnation of that. Some really powerful Beltway insiders and some incredibly high production values in the in the videos. And as you say, I mean, Mitt Romney is another similar figure who's who ran for the presidency as Republican and is very strongly against Donald Trump, as far as I can see, or at least has been very critical of him. One story I did want to just discuss with you from the campaign was the New York Post smoking gun story. It's really interesting in the context of what we've been talking about, because the story basically says that emails have been recovered from this mysterious laptop incriminating Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, and ultimately leading to the removal of a public prosecutor in Ukraine, who was apparently, at least according to the conspiracy, who was undermining or investigating the company that Hunter Biden was working for. Now, this is very reminiscent of 2016, Hillary Clinton's emails. The big difference this time is that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have, while they haven't removed the story, they've kind of dampened its capacity to spread. Now, the story is chock full of massive holes. I mean, I think anyone who looks at it fairly would say that you couldn't you wouldn't want to place all your marbles in that basket. But nonetheless, this is exactly the kind of story that in 2016 could have made a shift. And I think we've only seen a very modest shift towards Donald Trump in the betting since that came out. And I just wonder, I don't know, Elaine or Richard, did you think, are the social media companies in a way also pricing in a Biden win and trying to get on the right side of him? Or are they actually concerned about democracy? Or is it something else entirely?
Well, I think I have a cynical view on this. I don't think they're that bothered about democracy, to be honest. I
think they're getting lined up behind Biden, right?
I think so. And in the same way that we heard allegedly that the UK government has sort of pretty well ditched Trump now because they probably worked out that they're gonna, they don't want to be on the wrong side of Biden.
Maybe a bit late, a bit late to that party though. Better late than never.
Maybe that's the case, but I think that, as you say, the stuff that I've been reading about that today, little by little, that whole thing is being discredited, isn't it? That, as you say, there's some huge holes. Could they be absolutely sure that it was Hunter Biden that dropped the laptop off? Can they be absolutely sure it was his laptop? All of this stuff is all sort of shrouded in doubt, isn't it?
The story doesn't stand up at a basic level. I mean, like the prosecutor who Biden insisted on going was actually delaying and obfuscating the investigation into his son's company.
Yeah.
The position that he should leave was an international one, not just a whim of Joe Biden's. So even at that most basic logical level, I think there's, you couldn't look at it and really believe it.
I think if that was the Trump card, I don't think it's won that hand, is it?
It's fallen a bit. I think it was meant to be a big thing, but it hasn't really landed, and it's just interesting to see some of those mechanisms of the Hillary Clinton October surprise, from last time with the emails, with the sickness. I think, Elena, you talked quite a lot about it last week. It's been a bit of a damp squib so far. And broadly speaking, the betting markets are pretty much at that same level of around 64 to 66% in favor of Joe Biden as they were at the start of the week.
I mean, just to add a little bit more about that, I think what's been interesting about this Biden story is the story seems to be across the media today is not so much the New York Post story, but actually the social media reaction to it. So it's almost like that story gets lost, so to speak, as you're kind of scrolling through the stories.
Yeah, it gets lost in, I suppose, two senses, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's prevented from spreading, and then that prevention becomes the story. Yeah, so it's interesting. And then just the last thing is to talk a little bit about the campaign trail. So it looked like a great crack in Florida, YMCA, hugs and kisses for everybody. Anyone who's had it is immune now, apparently. So it does look like a bit of a party, but I do wonder, that it doesn't. It looks to me like if you look where Trump is going, that he's in quite a defensive mode at this point. He's shoring up rather than attacking. And obviously, if he doesn't win Florida, there's very few routes to the electoral college. So yeah, I think behind the kind of craziness, there is a little bit of rationality. But when you wake up and you watch these things on the news, I mean, the guy, YMCA is a pretty straightforward dance. Yeah. And he mangles it. So yeah, can't even get that right, Donald. All right, well, we'll leave it there. So a slightly quieter week following 2 weeks of a big stretch coming into the campaign towards Joe Biden. We're sort of still in a similar place now as we were last week, and so we look forward to seeing what next week holds. Maybe some breakdancing from Joe Biden. Who knows? So I would just like to say that the podcast is sponsored by the Cherish Digital Economy Centre at Swansea University, and to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to talking with you next week. Thank you very much.